Hello, everyone. This is Mercedes Prince with the Bureau of Long-Term Services and Supports, and I am going to be talking about the new draft level of care algorithm 2.0 and how you can determine a participant's level of care score using this algorithm and this new worksheet tool that we have developed. So in order to do that, I'm going to be using 3 documents. The first is the algorithm, and I'm going to go a lot more in depth with the algorithm here in a few minutes, but essentially this is our scoring mechanism for level of care, and it is broken down into the categories that we are proposing to look at when determining level of care. So those categories are behavior, cognition, mobility, eating, toileting, bathing, dressing and grooming, rehab, treatments, med management, meal prep, and safety. And you can see that each of these categories is further broken down into these indicators. So what are we measuring when we say we're measuring behavior? Well, we're looking at things like wandering, verbal abuse, physical abuse, and then how do we measure wandering or verbal abuse? And that is what these strings of between 2 and 4 letters and numbers are indicating. So these strings of letters and numbers directly correspond to a question on the Enter-I. So in order to run a participant through the algorithm, you need the participant's Enter-I. And preferably you would be using the most recent one associated with their most recent reassessment. And it's easiest to do on your own if you can print out the Enter-I and use the paper version. Otherwise, it's a lot of scrolling up and down. But for the purposes of this training, we're going to use the electronic version. So the Enter-I is a robust document that is used by our assessors and reassessors to determine level of care and to aid in the development of care plans. So you can see that the assessment is broken down into sections, and each section is identified with a letter. So this is section A. If you scroll down, section E is mood and behaviors. And then each of these sections is further broken down into numbered kind of subsections. So you can see subsection 3 is behavior symptoms. So section E, number 3, and then if we wanted to look at this question, wandering, we would say that wandering is in section E, number 3, letter A, or E3A, and that is where those strings of letters and numbers that I was referring to on the algorithm come into play. It is they're identifiers for specific questions. E3A is this wandering question here. So the third document that we're going to be using is the worksheet. And the worksheet is kind of an in-between, a mediator for the algorithm and the Enter-I. These are both very long documents, and scrolling back and forth between the algorithm and the Enter-I can get a little confusing. So this worksheet has taken all of the indicators that are located here on the algorithm, so all of the behavior indicators, all of the cognition, mobility, and listed them out clearly here in a line with a space next to them for the coding found on the Enter-I for each of these indicators. And I think the best way to explain that really would be to just go ahead and start doing it. So you'll see behavior is broken down into 10 indicators. And these indicators, again, are the same indicators that are here on the algorithm. They're just kind of listed out here clearly. So the first indicator for behavior is E3A. So we will scroll to section E, number 3, letter A, and that is wandering. And the code in the box next to this question is a 0, and that is what we are looking for to put into our worksheet. So we will put 0 next to E3A on the worksheet. Then the next indicator is E3B. So we will again stay in section E, number 3. We'll move to letter B, verbal abuse. And the code in the box next to E3B is 0. So I will put E3B equals 0 here on the worksheet. The next indicator is E3C, which is going to be right beneath E3B. Physical abuse. The code here is 0, so I will put 0 next to E3C on the worksheet. E3D is also a 0, so I will put 0 here on the worksheet. E3E is 0, so I will put E3E as 0 on the worksheet. And E3F is 0, so I will put 0 here on the worksheet. And that is all you need to do when scoring on the worksheet. But if you are curious as to what a 0 means for these questions, you can look right above here at the scoring and see that 0 means not present. So the coding behind this 0 that is in these boxes means that these behaviors were not present. So the next indicator is a jump to section J. So we're going to scroll to section J. So it's section J, number 3, letter G, abnormal thought process, and the coding in the inter-I for J3G is a 0, so I will put 0 next to J3G. The next indicator is J3H, which is here under J3G. The code in that box is 0, so I will put a 0 here for J3H. And the next indicator is J3I, and the code here for J3I is a 0, so I'll put 0 next to J3I on the worksheet. And then we jump again to section N. Section N, number 7, letter B, and you'll want to pay close attention here because while most of the coding boxes line up with the question, this section does not. So this top box is referring to N7A, and this bottom box is referring to N7B. So you'll want to make sure that you're looking at the bottom box here, which in this case is a 1. So I will put a 1 here next to N7B on the worksheet. And then we will move on to cognition. And the first indicator for cognition is C1. So we will scroll back up to C, section C, number 1. The code here is a 1. So I will put 1 in the box next to C1. The next indicator is C2A. So we are in section C, number 2, letter A. The code here is a 1. So I will put a 1 here next to C2A on the worksheet. C2B is the next indicator. The code on the inter-I for C2B is a 0, so I will put 0 here. C2C has a code of 0, so I will put 0 next to C2C on the worksheet. C3C is a 0, so I'll put C3C 0 on the worksheet. And then we jump sections to D1. D1 is a 0, so I will put 0 on the worksheet. And finally, D2 is a 0, so I will put a 0 here on the worksheet. For the sake of time, I have pre-filled a lot of these in because they are the same concept. You go to the section letter and then find the number and then find the letter, and you put the coding from the box next to that question into the worksheet. However, there are a couple of indicators on here that are a little tricky, and I wanted to make sure we had time to go through those together. So specifically, rehab. All of our rehab indicators, there are 4 of them, they are all located in section N. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll to section N. Section N, number 3. So you will see here that there are 2 columns. In section N, number 3, for this little subsection, there are multiple columns that you could be looking at for your numbers. And you'll see that all of these indicators end in A, and that is referring to this section right here. So when you are scoring the rehab section, you want to be looking in column A, not in these 3 B columns. So our first indicator is N3EA. So N3E column A, and that is a 0. So I will put a 0 here on the worksheet. N3FA is a 0, so I'll put 0 on the worksheet. N3GA is a 0, so I'll put 0 on the worksheet. And N3IA is a 0 as well. So just keep in mind that you're wanting to look in this A column right here for rehab. And then the other two that are a little tricky that I want to go through together are med management and meal prep. And both of these categories only have one indicator each, so that makes them pretty simple, but there is a tricky component to those. So let's go through those together. So you'll see that both of these are in the G1 section, so G1. And the scoring in this section has two columns. This column is for performance, and this column is for capacity. And we know that for a variety of reasons, a participant could be performing below or above their capacity. And if you see, the capacity is based on their ability to carry out that activity as independently as possible. So for various reasons, these two numbers could be different. We want to make sure that for the sake of scoring level of care, we are scoring based on their capacity. So we want to make sure that we are scoring based on this second column over here on the right. So for managing meds, the indicator is G1D, so G1D, managing meds. And in this case, this gentleman is performing at capacity, so these numbers are the same, but if that were not the case, it would be even more important to make sure that you are looking at this number on the right, the capacity number. So that score is a 4, so I will put 4 here on the worksheet. And then meal prep is G1A, and it's the same idea. You want to make sure that you're taking the number from this right-hand box for capacity. So that code is a 6, and I will put a 6 here for G1A. And like I said before, I pre-filled a lot of these in for the sake of time. So once we have all of our indicators filled in with their inter-I coding next to them, we are done with the inter-I and can pull up the algorithm. So we want to make it clear that the way that you score the worksheet is not to add up these numbers, these coding. This is just coding. These numbers do not actually represent a 1 or a 4. These are just codes for the inter-I. The way that we're going to actually score this is by using the algorithm. So the algorithm is broken down into categories, as I mentioned before, and each category has the algorithm for each possible score. So in behavior, a participant can score a 3, 6, or 9. So these algorithms represent the minimum qualifications or the minimum criteria that a participant would need in order to score at that level. So this is not computer code. This does not have every possible combination of answers that a participant could have for these indicators. It is just the minimum criteria. And for that reason, it is possible for a participant to meet the criteria for a 3 and the criteria for a 6. And in that case, you want to make sure you're always scoring the participant at the higher of the scores that they meet the criteria for. And you can think of this in kind of a real world example. The criteria to be considered a millionaire is to have $1 million, and the criteria to be considered a billionaire is to have $1 billion. So Bill Gates is very wealthy and has it meets the qualifications for both a millionaire and a billionaire. But when we refer to him, we would refer to him as a billionaire because that is the higher of those two classes, and we would refer to him as a billionaire, not a millionaire. And that's the same way you want to think about this. If a participant meets the qualifications for more than one of these, we would score them with the higher of the 2 or 3. So with that in mind, let's start scoring the algorithm. So the way we're going to do this is kind of like a scavenger hunt. So for each of these indicators, on the enter-I, E3A was a 0. So we are going to come into the algorithm and highlight everywhere that E3A equals 0. On the enter-I, E3B was a 0, so we are going to highlight anywhere that E3B equals 0. E3C was a 0 on the enter-I, so I will highlight E3C equals 0. E3D was 0, so I'll highlight E3D equals 0. E3E was 0. E3F was 0. J3G was 0. J3H was 0. J3I was 0, and N7B on the enter-I had a code of 1, so I will highlight N7B equals 1. Now, to make sure that we are scoring the participant at the highest possible score, we're going to scroll down and see, does the participant meet the criteria for a level of care equals 9? So in order for the participant to meet level of care equals 9, he would need to have N7B equals 2 or N7B equals 3, and one of these indicators in this bottom chunk. So we highlighted everything that the participant had on the enter-I. So since nothing in this level of care equals 9 is highlighted, we know that the participant did not have any of these indicator scores. So the participant does not meet the criteria for level of care equals 9. If you scroll up, level of care equals 6, again requires that something in this be highlighted. And since none of these indicators are highlighted, we know that the participant did not have them on the enter-I and does not meet the criteria for level of care equals 6. The criteria for level of care equals 3 is that any of these indicators be present on the enter-I. And since this one is highlighted, N7B equals 1, we know that that was present on the enter-I, and therefore this participant meets the criteria for a level of care equals 3 for behavior. So something you'll want to pay close attention to is or versus and. So this criteria shows that N7B equals 1 or E3A equals 1 or E3B equals 1 or E3C equals 1 and so on. The ors mean that if any of these are present on the enter-I, if any of these are highlighted on our algorithm, that person meets the criteria for level of care equals 3. However, if you look at the criteria for level of care equals 9, it requires that N7B equal 2 or N7B equals 3, so either of these would need to be highlighted and one of these would need to be highlighted. So you'll want to pay close attention, and this will come up in a couple that we do farther on, and so we'll get some hands-on experience with those, but you want to pay close attention when you're scoring that they meet the specific criteria, because just looking to see if something is highlighted in this algorithm would not be enough, because if just N7B were highlighted, that would not fit the criteria for level of care equals 9. You would have to have N7B highlighted and one of these highlighted. So as we move on, pay close attention to the ands and the ors. So now that we have determined that the level of care for this participant for behavior is a 3, I'm going to put this 3 here. And as we go along, we're going to score each category and then add up the scores that are over here. And that is how we will get the level of care score. Not by adding up the enter-I coding, we will be adding up the corresponding level of care scores for the categories. So the next category is cognition. The first indicator for cognition was C1, and the coding on the enter-I was a 1. So I'm going to highlight C1 equals 1 on the algorithm. And you want to be sure that you highlight anywhere C1 equals 1 because they are often, some indicators are present in more than one algorithm criteria. So the second indicator was C2A. C2A was 1 on the enter-I, so I'm going to highlight anywhere that C2A equals 1 here on the algorithm. C2B was 0, so I'm going to highlight anywhere C2B equals 0. C2C was 0 on the enter-I, so I will highlight C2C equals 0. C3C was 0. D1 was 0. And D2 was 0. And just a reminder that we are getting these responses off of the worksheet, but these numbers on the worksheet came from the enter-I. So this is, again, just this worksheet is a middleman. It has all the information that's on the enter-I, but instead of having to flip through the enter-I while we are filling out the algorithm, you have all of your answers here in a cheat sheet. So we have now highlighted all of the indicators for cognition. So cognition has a trigger question. If C1 equals 5 in your participant's enter-I, that participant would automatically receive services under our new level of care algorithm. In this case, we know that our participant that we are working on right now does not have C1 equals 5 on their enter-I because we highlighted everything that the participant had on the enter-I, and this C1 equals 5 is not highlighted. So the participant does not meet the criteria for the trigger question, the 18 points. We can see that none of the criteria are highlighted for level of care equals 9, so the participant does not meet criteria for level of care equals 9. We look at level of care equals 6, and something is highlighted for level of care equals 6. However, if we pay attention to this and, the criteria for level of care equals 6 is that C1 equals 3 and one of these bottom indicators is present. Since C1 does not equal 3, this is not highlighted, it was not present on the enter-I, then the participant does not meet the criteria for this level of care score, even though they did have one of the indicators present. And so that's where we really want to pay attention to the ands, because that is disqualifying for this participant. So we will move on to level of care equals 3. Level of care equals 3 requires that C1 equals 1 or C1 equals 2. In this case, the participant had C1 equals 1. And it also requires that one of these indicators from this bottom section be highlighted as well. So since we have C1 equals 1 and C2A equals 1, this participant meets the criteria for level of care equals 3. So I will put 3 here for their level of care score for cognition. Moving on to mobility, we will highlight the indicator coding for mobility. So G2E was a 4, so I will highlight G2E equals 4. G2F was 4 on the enter-I, so I will highlight G2F equals 4. G2I was 4. And G3A was 1, so I will highlight G3A equals 1. And if we scroll down, we see that the participant does not meet the requirements for the trigger. The participant does not meet the requirements for a 9. The participant does not meet the requirements for a 6. The participant does meet the requirements for level of care equals 3, because the requirements for level of care equals 3 are that any of these 6 indicators be highlighted. And since that is true, this participant scores a 3 for their mobility level of care score. So I'll put 3 here on the worksheet and move on to eating. Eating has 2 indicators. On the participant's enter-I, their G2J was coded as a 1, so we will highlight G2J equals 1. And their K2E indicator was coded as a 0, so we will highlight K2E equals 0. So we can see that the participant does not meet the criteria for a trigger because G2J equals 6 is not highlighted, so it was not on the worksheet, which means it was not on the enter-I. G2J was not 5, so they do not meet the requirements for level of care equals 9. They do not meet the requirements for level of care equals 6. The participant does meet the requirements for level of care equals 3 because he had J2J equals 1. So I will put a 3 here for the participant's eating category level of care. Moving on to toileting. For G2G, the participant had a code of 4 on the entry, so I will highlight G2G equals 4. And for G2H, the participant had a 4 as well, so I will highlight G2H equals 4 on the algorithm. You can see that the participant does not meet the requirements for level of care equals 9. It does not meet the requirements for level of care equals 6. He does meet the requirements for level of care equals 3 because he has G2G equals 4 or G2H equals 4. Either of those would have qualified him for a level of care equals 3 for toileting. So I will put 3 here as his toileting category level of care on the worksheet. Bathing only has one indicator. The categories with one indicator are very easy because whatever that indicator score is determines level of care. So G2A equals 5, so level of care equals 6. And you only have one indicator to consider here. So we will put a 6 here for the bathing category level of care. For dressing and grooming, G2B was 5 on the enter-I, so we will highlight G2B equals 5. G2C was 4, so we'll highlight G2C equals 4 on the algorithm. And G2D had a code of 5 on the enter-I, so we will highlight G2D equals 5. And we can see that the participant meets the criteria for the highest level of care equals 6 for the dressing and grooming category, because the criteria for level of care equals 6 in this case is that any of these indicator codings be present on the enter-I, and this participant had 2 present. So he meets the criteria for a 6 for dressing and grooming level of care. Next is rehab. Rehab is an Rehab has possible scores of 3, 6, or 9. The first rehab indicator was N3E, and it was a 0. Actually, we can see that all rehab indicators were 0. So I will just go ahead and highlight equals 0 for all indicators. And since we only highlighted things in the 0, we know we did not meet the criteria for 9, then did not meet the criteria for 6, he did not meet the criteria for 3, so he will have a 0 for rehab. Treatments. Treatments is an all or nothing category. So we are looking for specific treatments. If the participant has any of those specific treatments, they will score a 6. If the participant does not have any of those treatments, they will score a 0. So we will look, the indicator for H1 was a 3 on the enter-I. So we will highlight H1 equals 3. H3 was a 3 on the enter-I, so we'll highlight H3 equals 3. And then the rest of the indicators were 0, so I will highlight L1 equals 0, K3 equals 0, N2G equals 0, N2H equals 0, N2J equals 0, and N2K equals 0. And again, we only highlighted in the 0 section, so we know that the participant did not have any of the criteria needed to score a 6 for level of care in treatment. And so the participant will have a 0 for their treatment score. So we'll put that on the scoring worksheet. Managing meds is next. Managing meds is just one indicator. G1D was a code of 4 on the enter-I, so I will highlight G1D equals 4. And since there's only one indicator to look at, we know that that indicates a level of care equals 3. So we will have a 3 here for the managing meds category level of care. Meal prep is G1A. This participant had a code of 6 for G1A, and that one code will then determine that the participant has qualified for a level of care equals 6 for meal prep. So we will give him a 6 on the worksheet for meal prep. And then the last category is safety. So we will highlight the indicators for safety. So the first indicator was D4, and the participant had a score of 1. So I will highlight D4 equals 1. J1 equals 1. So I will highlight anywhere that J1 equals 1. J3A was 4 on the inter-eye, so I will highlight J3A equals 4. J3B was 3 on the inter-eye, so I will highlight J3B equals 3. J3C was 4, so I will highlight J3C equals 4. And J3D was 4, so I will highlight J3D equals 4. So first we will look to see, does the participant meet the criteria for the highest possible level of care score, which in the case for safety is a 6. So the criteria for a level of care equals 6 are that the participant have either D4 equals 4 or J1 equals 1, 2, or 3, and one of these indicators from the bottom. So we see our participant did not have D4 equals 4, but he does have J1 equals 1 and J3A equals 4 and J3B equals 3 and J3C equals 4 and J3D equals 4. Any of these bottom indicators combined with one of these top indicators would qualify that participant for a score of 6. So this participant has a 6 for safety. So this is, again, someplace where it's very important to look at the ORs. So the participant does not have to have D4 equals 4. It's D4 equals 4 or J1 equals 1 and J3A equals 4. So that's what qualified the participant in this case. So he has a score of 6 for safety. And then I already did the math and had it pre-filled here. So what you would do next is add up all of the category scores and put that total number here. So this participant would have a 42, a level of care score of 42 under the new algorithm, and you can see that the threshold to receive services is a score of 18, so he would continue to receive services. And you can see I also put over here, based on his notes in cyber access, that he has a 42 currently.